Well, thank you everyone for attending our important webinar today. We are excited to be here. I am Amy Terpeluk. I head up our global purpose and social impact practice at Finn Partners, and I am honored to be joined by Brianne Chai-Onn, our global sustainability lead at Finn, Christopher Nial, a senior partner in Finn's global health practice and EMEA public health co-lead, and last but certainly not least, Glenn Mandziuk, CEO of the World Sustainable Hospitality Alliance. Thank you all for joining me today. So the moment is here. COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan, November 11th to 22nd. And in preparing for this webinar today, I was very impressed to learn that we knew last year's COP28 was highly attended and critically important in this space. But last year in Dubai was the largest attended climate COP in history, with over 97,000 delegates, 150 heads of state, and business leaders, nonprofits, influencers, media from all across the globe focused on this very important issue. So today's webinar, we're going to look at two things. One, what is happening on the ground and what do you need to know about COP29? How do you break through from a communications perspective? We are communications professionals, and I want to ground our conversation in the two pillars of this year's conference: enhancing ambition and enabling action. Critically important to think about as we look at this conversation today. So, Christopher, I am going to start with you because you are the man on the ground in COP29. Tell us, before we get started here in the other questions, what are you hearing? What's happening?
Well, I'm the first on the ground from Finn. I'll be joined by other colleagues shortly. And what I'm about to tell you will change as the conference is opened. Nobody has sight of opening remarks until the day, so things can really change. But I'll let those in the US talk about the elephant in the room. On the flight over, the results of the election, that's all anybody wants to talk about. So I'll let you jump in afterwards. But climate finance, so they're calling this the climate COP, particularly establishing the new collective quantified goal, NCQG, for climate finance beyond 2025. It's a new overall climate finance goal that will replace the existing 100 billion annual, 100 billion US, annual target set in 2009, which expires next year. And it aims to set a new higher target for climate finance from developed to developing countries post 2025. With ongoing negotiations about sorry, I can't say this word, the operation of the Loss and Damage Fund established at COP27.
Yes.
The fund currently exists as a separate mechanism with completely voluntary contributions. So the NCQG negotiations might influence its future funding, but it remains a distinct entity. And it's all been about pledges to the Loss and Damage Fund. 702 million were pledged, but only 10 million of that has been delivered so far. So it's really insufficient by many experts in developing countries. Enhancing nationally determined contributions, NDCs, to align with the 1.5 degree temperature goal, because current commitments are falling woefully short. Adaptation, so we talk about adaptation, which is dealing with climate change rather than mitigation, which is preventing it. adaptation is going to be a significant topic at COP29, and the role of nature-based solutions, protecting biodiversity alongside climate action, and very, very important, climate changes, health impacts, and
Yes,
tourism role for the first time
yes.
receiving increased attention this year.
Thank you. And that leads to my question here to you, Glenn. As Christopher noted, this is really the quote finance cop, if you will, to summarize what Christopher just said. And then I mentioned enhanced ambition and action, and there is an enhanced climate action in tourism focus this year. So, can you talk to us as the world gathers here? What role do you see the hospitality industry playing in driving meaningful climate action, particularly within the framework of net positive hospitality?
It's a great question, Amy. And the first word that comes out of my mouth is amen, because it took 29 COPs to finally get tourism on the main agenda. So, we're getting there, right? So we got
Yes.
progress is happening. It started, tourism has taken a long time to get on the agenda. And, it started with commitments. And the first commitment that the industry made really in a concerted way was in Glasgow in COP26 under the Glasgow Declaration, where we really made commitments to net zero emissions by 2050, a real focus on climate resistance and resilience, and starting to establish some commitments to sustainable practice. Immediately following that, we established, as you pointed out, net positive hospitality. So this is about giving back to the destination more than we take. It's a real commitment to that effort, and ultimately it's about being seen as a contributor to the issues at hand. So yes, finally, COP29 is tourism's on the main stage, November the 20th, particularly. And where we're playing a big role is, when we talk about finance, you got to be able to collectively measure the industry's progress in a clear and transparent way that is third-party verified in order for us to really showcase how the industry can contribute. And, we work in a very fragmented sector, it's really a network of businesses under the banner tourism. And to get everybody to agree to a common way and methodology to measure progress and enable that third-party verification is a steep hill to climb. But I'm very, very proud to say that at this COP, we will be formally announcing that we have agreement on carbon, water, waste, and energy methodologies globally within our work. And we'll be working to formally announce that in partnership, particularly with UN Tourism. And UN Tourism has been a significant partner in this effort. And so not only are we going to talk about the same language and ways of measuring those key topic areas from an industry perspective, but it'll also be aligned at the destination level. So again, we're all talking the same language, and that will enable us to effectively open new doors and leverage new investments into the sector to really rise to the occasion to support our commitments to Glasgow Declaration. And, tourism absolutely can be a force for good when properly managed. And that's the key words to this situation. And you can't manage something you don't measure. And so this is where a real opportunity has now happened, and a transition has occurred for the sector that have come together. We work very closely with the World Travel and Tourism Council, and they will also be there and an active participant. The Global Sustainable Tourism Council will be there. Travelist will be there. And these are the kind of organizations that break down the silos and all work together as a coherent unit, collective unit. That has been the mistake, quite frankly, the industry has made for years, is not coming as a collective. It's very hard to cut through the noise. As you pointed out rightly, Amy, a lot of people coming to one place at one time, talking about these issues, and it's going to be very difficult for that to happen if you're trying to do it individually, if you're not part of a bigger movement as well. So these are two things that are happening, and that's just one of the things that are happening, I know, but from a hospitality perspective, it's game changing.
Thank you, Glenn. Congratulations on that achievement. And we appreciate you giving us breaking news hot off the press during our webinar as well. I want to ask Brianne a question based on something you just said here about you can't manage what you don't measure. So, Brianne, when we look at the ambitions of COP29 and national plans and a focus on transparency, can you tell us how organizations can best balance transparency and ambition when communicating on their sustainability goals in such a visible platform? You know, based on what you're saying here, Glenn, too, you have to measure. And there's a lot of scrutiny and attention to the impact we're making and whether or not we're achieving these goals that we're talking about. So, Brianne, tell us a little bit about this.
Oh, absolutely. I think, we're talking about, commitments, of course, are important, but what's really going to be in the conversation now is about the how. How are we getting this done? How are we measuring it? And when? And setting really, timelines for progress, because like Christopher mentioned, the pace of progress is not fast enough for us to meet targets. So this is where everyone needs to come together more. And I think, Glenn, you just said it rightly. So much of this measurement comes from, standardization and getting everyone on the same page to start talking in the same language. And a lot of that does come from regulation. So it is looking at industry and how they can come together. And another thing that's going to be really important, is talking about scaling efforts, talking about stronger collaboration. How can we collaborate together more? And also learning, insights from, the different challenges that we're all facing and really coming together to accelerate that action. And I think that's where those are the conversations that need to be happening. And that's what's going to break through, because commitments are all out there. It's good, but this is what we need to be talking about now.
It reminds me, Brianne, I was looking at obviously all of the sectors and commitments and everything that's happening on the ground at COP. And there was a quote that really jumped out at me from the UN Environment Program Executive Director: "Climate crunch time is here." And that's really what we're talking about now, is we have to meet these goals. We have to make progress. The time is now. It's very much reminiscent of what we were talking about just a few weeks ago with the Climate Week in New York City, where we were all together here.
Absolutely.
So Christopher, we're talking about tourism and hospitality. We talked about finance. Again, we're in the phase of the webinar here where we're talking about what's happening on the ground. And you had mentioned public health and climate change and how we know they are increasingly interlinked. So from your perspective, what are the most pressing health impacts of climate change that you're hoping to see prioritized at COP29 from the health perspective?
Well, thank you, Amy. At this point, we can only talk about adaptation. So there's heat-related illnesses and mortality, especially among vulnerable populations like the elderly. Recent data in 2022 shows that heat-related deaths have increased by a whopping 167% compared to the 1990s. Spread of infectious diseases like dengue, malaria, and other mosquito or what we call vector-borne illnesses are on the increase as temperature rises, and in places in Northern Europe where you wouldn't expect to hear of malaria, West Nile, dengue, because of the increase in temperature rises. Those diseases are being seen a lot more. Food and water insecurity leads to malnutrition and waterborne diseases. Air pollution related respiratory and cardiovascular diseases are on the increase thanks to climate change. And one thing that often gets forgotten about is the mental health impacts from extreme weather events, displacement, because, you know, communities, populations have to move because they have no food, they have no water. And climate anxiety is really on the rise, especially amongst young people who feel they really don't have any voice, any agency.
I appreciate that, and especially your focus on mental health and the climate anxiety. And I think it's all the more important. I'll keep saying this, that we look at action so that there is a sense of something being done to very much allay this anxiety. So Glenn, I'm going to take it back to you with that, because I did want to give you a minute. We jumped right ahead into COP to talk about the World Sustainable Hospitality Alliance. Back to what we're talking about here is, the action and how can we show that we are making progress. Can you share tell us more about the Alliance and some of your recent initiatives where you feel like you're making strides and progress, especially looking at the shift from sustainability to net positive? I know you touched on it before, but I want to give you a moment to talk more about the Alliance in the context of COP.
No, thank you. Thank you, Amy, again. The Alliance has been around for over 30 years. We are a global charity. It was established by King Charles III back in 1992, out of the Rio Conference. And so it has those roots all the way back to there, where he assembled the 11 largest hotel companies in the world to start talking about this stuff. But in 2021, we adopted, right alongside the Glasgow Declaration, this notion of net positive hospitality. And in that time frame, we grew 400% in terms of the voices around the table and the companies. And we went from those 11 companies to sort of well north of 60 and 300 brands at the C-suite level, 55,000 hotels in the portfolio, 7.5 million rooms of influence, which is a significant block, about 45% of the global footprint. And it continues to grow. And that's when you adopt a clear North Star for the industry that says, this is what we want to do. We want to stand out in the crowd of conversation as well, because I dare say not a lot of economic sectors out there have said, hey, we're going to be net positive versus just net zero or sustainable. And it starts to change the conversation. And with that comes with it some real focuses on, as I mentioned, we're now just getting there where we're having uniform measurement. This should have happened, 30 years ago, but here we are. We are updating our carbon tool to ensure that it's GHG protocol, life cycle supported, verifiable, third-party verifiable. All that is being built into the system, and that is part of the commitments being made now. And we've got a World Academy for Sustainable Hospitality, which provides training to the practitioners in the hotels by department, certified training. So if we're asking hotels to become more net positive in its approach, what can I do as a front desk clerk to help make that happen, or in the kitchen, or at the general manager level? It has to be, again, common language, because far too often we make this too complicated through acronyms and languages that are so different, but talking about the exact same thing. So we have this real opportunity here to harmonize not only the metrics, but harmonize how the training is done in the departments across. And so all that is now in play. And then we do projects on the ground, whether it be employability work to showcase how you can help disadvantaged, provide training support, and ultimately a job, to working on circularity or food waste initiatives or supply chain optimization. The list is quite endless as we work towards this effort, but it's going to be supported and underpinned by a global impact fund that will focus its investments on enterprises that will help the transition to address the very things that we're trying to move forward at COP and address climate action when it comes to energy transition, food systems from procurement to food waste, and nature positive enterprises to really help galvanize and inspire and ultimately scale those companies to make the difference that we need. So we're putting those fundamental building blocks in place that will ensure that we live up to or get closer to the commitments we've made within the Glasgow Declaration.
Appreciate that, Glenn. I feel like you may have been a fly on the wall when Brianne and I have communications conversations about why do we make this so difficult to understand. Brianne's chuckling because as communicators, numerous times we're taught, what do these acronyms mean? How do we break this down in a simple and impactful message and way? And what you're saying here, and I wrote this down, and again, thank you for everything you're doing to advance our collective mission here. How do you stand out in a crowded conversation? And as Finn, a marketing and communication agency, we're expert communicators. We're experts on these topics. Christopher said we've all been at COP. He's the first of a Finn contingent coming in. We understand the space. And Brianne, I'm coming to you with this, back to standing out in a crowded conversation. How do we advise organizations, corporations on the ground to ensure that their sustainability messages break through the noise effectively? And by noise, I mean that in a positive way. But how do we break through with messages? How do you stand out in a crowded conversation? What does that look like? What are some tips you can tell us as we think about COP?
I mean, I think, yeah, when just this,
Brianne's laughing, I know.
I
Glenn,
know.
it's like you're part of our conversations.
And it is really challenging too. I mean, being able to kind of back up your commitments, what you're saying. And it is, you know, the proof is in the pudding. Like, we need to talk about impact. We need to talk about what is really actually moving the needle. And I think that is what people are looking for again. You know, COP is an extremely crowded space. So even when we are advising our clients, I mean, so much of it is about preparation because there's so many things you cannot control, but what you can control, your own message, your own content. So what you're going out there to say, your own channels, how you are blogging about this, or, you know, your LinkedIn posts, your messages, like you're doing, an announcement. I mean, there are organizations that will have big announcements, but there are organizations that are attending COP that will not. And they're there to, you know, they'll have speaking engagements, they're there to network. And I think the conversation is, you know, after a while, and this happened to me too at climate change, at Climate Week, it was just people talking at you and, you know, spewing, and you really need to, so the preparation is key, because once you have that down, you can be present in those meetings. And so much of it is being present to really connect with people while you're there. And that's what's going to stick with people after the meeting is done. And this is what's more important, I think. I mean, and this is, you know, for those, it's what's going to happen after all the talking is done. I'm already looking for past, you know, what's next after COP, you know, you're going to talk, you're going to meet new people, you're going to learn a lot, and then the real work starts. And so making those connections and being present in those meetings to connect and get your message out there and let them know, understand what you're working on, what your impact is, where you are, some of your, you know, what your challenges are, but what you're learning. And that's where you can start really creating those opportunities for collaboration that are going to move the needle moving forward after all of these meetings. So, I mean, a lot of it is, you know, your message is your message, and you need to focus on your own content and getting that out, but at the same time being present in those meetings to really make those connections.
It's interesting from a communication standpoint, and Brianne, you and Glenn have a similar theme to what you're saying here, which is the power of the collective and collaboration and how we're all working together. So on one hand, as an organization, it's important to showcase the impact you're making and how you are truly solving for these problems in unique and distinctive ways. But at the same time, it's important that we have these collective conversations and show that there is really, strength in numbers. So Christopher, with that being said, if you look at the health space and what is happening at COP, how do you generate buzz and interest for the collective that's happening at COP when you look at the health sector and how everyone's coming together to really, again, having a critical moment?
Thanks, Amy. And actually, I'd agree with everything Brianne just said. And maybe many of these things I'm just going to mention would resonate with many sectors throughout
Sure.
COP29. Glenn mentioned this one thing that's so important: data, data, data. Facts, not assumptions, are essential. I'd suggest collaborating with health professionals or professionals in your field, civil society, and organizations to amplify your messaging. Frame climate action as a public health imperative and not just an environmental issue, and advocate for health impact assessments to be integrated into all climate policies. Thanks, Amy.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, Brianne.
Amy, I just wanted to add
Yes,
another thing too, when it
please.
comes to health, and even what we're talking about too with hospitality and so forth, is the interconnection. I mean, we're also just coming off of COP16 in Colombia and biodiversity. And this was the first time they really recognized the interconnection between biodiversity and climate. And then there's biodiversity, climate, and health, and then when you think about travel hospitality too, I mean, the interconnect, obviously, the destinations where you're going to, the natural resources, there's just also seeing these interconnections, and exactly what Christopher just said is how you position this issue within your sector. It's all interconnected, and to connect those dots for people and connect it back to the data and to the money.
And absolutely, we were at we've made a commitment to COP16, and it was actually in COP15 when we came together as an industry between, again, the World Travel and Tourism Council, UN Tourism, and our alliance to really tackle nature positive tourism and make this real commitment to biodiversity and this effort. And the issue is that we've been there, and this is something that's really important here, because you can transition, as what's happened here for our industry finally, you can transition from a side event in time to be on the main event. But you have to do some of the lifting in those side events to start to be heard. And that's what we've done now with COP15 and 16. Because, it's about building trust with those that are in charge of the secretariat, quite frankly, to get to that level. And trust comes from staying committed and coming year after year, showcasing progress.
Yep.
With as Christopher just pointed out, verifiable data to support that progress. And then people will start to take you seriously. And I think the other big thing is, if you're in another sector and not tourism and hospitality, reach out to those kind of groups like us and representing your sector, and see if they're actually going to represent the industry at those events, and see if you can tag into some of that conversation so that they become more advocates for you as well, in that effort of getting onto the main conversation. As a person that has gone to these COPs now for about 4 or 5 of them now, one big mode of advice is if you could get your hands on the map and layout of the event, do it as quickly as you can, because I can tell you, you think you're just going to walk in stage or walk through the gate. There are long lines to get in the building. So don't think you're going to get in there right away when you're first registering. It's a bit of a interesting experience, I will say. And then you go from there and you go through security, and that's an interesting experience unto itself as well. And then you get into a venue, and in some COPs, it's a map on a wall and you're trying to figure out what's going on. Can be very confusing, and it can be overwhelming. So if you can get there, half a day ahead or a day ahead to just walk the grounds, get a feeling for it, you will get more advantage out of the few days that you're there, because it can be very overwhelming. And as Amy pointed out, it was a big event in Dubai, for example, and it's a big area to cover, and you miss out on opportunities because you just didn't know it was happening, to convey your brand and your company message.
That actually leads into a question that I had prepared for you, Glenn, that we're already
that's perfect.
talking about. So you answered my question in a way, but I think it's an important topic, is how do brands trying to be visible at major events, break through, in your opinion? And I had here, and you just touched on this though, distinguishing real action from the greenwashing, right?
Yeah.
Which is still something, it goes back to what we're talking about with transparency and being authentic. And so you touched on this, but expand a little bit more. How do you really break through and distinguish that?
It's if you are making very sound actions, and innovative actions in many ways, tied to measurable outcomes, you will be heard very clearly at an event like this. Your point is well taken. Far too often, people don't come as prepared as they should to convey. They have a concept or they have a commitment, but really there's not action connected to it or progress being made. So you're either they're gonna shake your hand and they're gonna smile at you, but the reality is you're probably never gonna find your way to the table that will ultimately allow you to influence the outcome, or to be able to share and really bring relevance to your brand in this commitment. So I would say you must come with those things in hand. And if you don't fully have those things in hand, then use this trip as a trip to just, gain insight on how the structure of this thing works. Find out those organizations like us and other sectors, how they operate and how can I connect, and then really set the table for what promises to be probably an extremely large COP in COP30 in Brazil. And that's a real opportunity that you could use this one as laying the groundwork for that one as well. So there's two ways of doing it. If you've got progress and you've got measurable outcomes, get on those, get in there. Let us know if you're in tourism and hospitality, and we'll make sure the connections are made. Or Finn, of course, Finn Partners will help you, I'm sure, make those connections. But at the other end, or use it as laying the groundwork for next year.
It's what, Brianne, you were saying before too, about being prepared, have those messages in place, be talking about your impact. So we're talking here, and Brianne, I'm going to go to you about what's happening on the ground and being part of this from a participatory standpoint at COP29. But for organizations, Brianne, that are unable to attend, because for everyone that's there, we know there is a lot of work happening and conversations outside of COP29. How do you engage with this conversation from afar? How do you effectively engage and talk about your progress and commitments whether you're at COP29 or you're just, following the conversations
Right.
and what's being, the strides that are being made.
Right. I mean, it is a far trip. A lot of organizations cannot
right.
be there. And UNFCCC has tried to make certain events available for webcast and so forth, especially for local communities, indigenous communities, that cannot make the trip to be there. And a lot of news will be coming out of this, like we said. So following those hashtags and kind of knowing your topics and where there might be an opportunity to interject, to make comments, to contact media, to make your own posts. And, again, there is so much to be covered. And I think staying focused to a certain degree and really following your part of the conversation is where you can make a bigger dent. And I already think, like you said, Glenn, it's the planning for post-COP and preparation for Brazil. I think COP30 is also going to be a really big one. And so seeing what's coming out of this and leading into the next COP.
Well, Christopher, can you tell us a little bit, as our reporter on the ground for the next 2 weeks, how what you're doing from a reporting standpoint very much goes back to this conversation of how can you keep informed? What can you do to be part of the conversation? So from your perspective as someone reporting there on the ground, how can our audiences engage? And, what tips do you have for them on any content or conversation around this?
Sure. Coming back to Brianne's point about hashtags, there are some official ones already, COP29 Azerbaijan and COP29 Baku. But if you look at the Fin Partners official channels and our on-the-ground team social media posts, you'll see a whole lot more. But I'm going to be utilizing multimedia and storytelling to make climate change and sustainability impacts much more tangible and relatable. BIM Partners clients can also take advantage of the official photos and videos from within the Blue Zone for the first time this year to provide credibility to their coverage. Tailor messaging to resonate with diverse cultural contents and values. I mean, the whole world is affected, but you need to talk to the local and regional communities. Engage local community leaders and civil society, as I mentioned before, as trusted messengers to amplify any of your content. Multilingual resources. Don't forget, the world doesn't just speak English. Really utilize cultural appropriate communication channels, and highlight how climate change impacts marginalized communities globally and disproportionately. And I shall be on the ground. I'm going to be writing a daily article, a 5-minute video summary, and some plenty of social media content. I'm going to be interviewing as many people as I can on behalf of Fin Partners and Medical Life, which is a sister publication we have. And I'm going to be spending a lot of time in the green zone as well as the blue zone. I can't actually take official photos and videos in the blue zone. I rely on the official photographers and videographers, but I can do a lot more in the green zone. So I look forward to exploring the green zone like I did last year. To me, it was kind of like a climate theme park on steroids. I mean, it was massive, absolutely massive, massive. I had to take a scooter to get around the green zone just to give you a concept of how large it is.
Goes back to what Glenn said, be prepared, come a day early, get the lay of the land. This is a broad space. So
Yeah.
I set up this webinar that we would discuss really two areas. One is what is happening on the ground, what are the what's the conversation, the events, the impact that we're looking to achieve. Now we just talked about very specifically the communications and how you break through. So I just want to end with one question to everybody that sums this up from really a macro micro lens from all of this, and the incredible value we get out of COP29, right? If we look at this. And so Glenn, I'll start with you. When you look at the value of COP, and this is an ending question for, again, everyone to give feedback, how much is in the policy outcomes, the climate mitigation commitments that are announced? We know there's a lot of news versus just these connections that everyone is making on the ground from NGOs, corporations, government agencies that will continue to drive impact and spur progress. So this is really the hopeful note, because I always like to end on a hopeful note. Where do we find value in all of this?
Yeah, well, it is both, I will say.
Yes.
Both is very equal in this approach. I've had the privilege to sit on a number of major boards with leading CEOs from particularly the financial community. And this connects beautifully with the topic of this year's COP. And they pat me on the head and they say, Glenn, we don't think your industry takes sustainability very seriously. And as a result, we put our money elsewhere and you don't even know it. Why that is that is a communication failure in a sense of how we are communicating our progress as a sector, because we are absolutely making progress, making commitments. Individual companies are trying to live up to what is being put in front of them. And yes, there are some that are at the front and some that are at the lagger end of it. But it is imperative that we use forums like this to change the narrative about what this industry and our sector is doing and standing for. And there's a real opportunity to use that forum and that stage to communicate our industry's progress in a clear, coherent way and directly on the climate agenda. And so this is where this comes in, and that comes from the networking and
Yes.
and talking to people and making sure they see our progress, the storytelling that Christopher has just articulated that needs to happen completely around there. But it is about making commitments on measuring progress in a clear and transparent way with concrete action. That will get people's attention. And then eventually the dinner room table talk on somebody's house out here in London somewhere who's not even associated with tourism is thinking about, well, it's not just about that visitor, that travel I might take next week and experience Mallorca or something like that and on the beach, but they can also think that tourism is saving the planet and is working to be a guardian of nature or is taking a very social responsibility way of doing business. When we expand our commitment like that, that's when the game has changed, and that's where a COP affords us that platform to do that.
Yes, very important. It's so interesting because when we work with our partners, there's a fine line between beating your chest and saying, look at everything we're doing. And to your point, Glenn, the importance of talking about commitments and measurable goals and progress, that message must be out there. We must get the word out, and we must do a strong job communicating no matter what the sector is. So I hope that these conversations are valuable to you as you move forward, because we certainly know the impact that you're making and the work that you're doing. Round robin, Christopher, to you, final thoughts.
Networking, you really never know who's going to be here. And with the UNFCCC website, there's an opportunity to see who is here. Jump on LinkedIn, connect with them, say, I know you're there, but I'd love to connect and maybe discuss when you get back. And storytelling. This COP is the second COP that put health on the agenda.
Brianne, I feel like again we're back to what is the action that will come out of this. So final words from you on the you know, again, we may be preaching to the choir a bit here, but the value of COP and these meetings, these convenings.
I mean, I would say very much like what's happening with hospitality. We were doing side events. We were actually not even in, I think we did a side event outside of the green zone. Then we got a side event in the green zone. Then we eventually got into the blue zone, you know, with food and agriculture as a solution to climate change. You know, when they started, and then all of a sudden they're talking about regenerative agriculture, then the Marrakesh partnership, you know, and so things can move. It is a long burn, and it is that networking. It is that stakeholder engagement. It is showing up and being there and starting, you know, you have to be consistent with your message and it will come. You know, the data will come, it takes time and so forth, but I think it is, you know, showing that progress and getting and getting your message out there, and you will start to see that impact, and more people will join, and it will start to, you know, you will gain that momentum. So I think these events and this stage is extremely important, for all the reasons. I agree with everything that Glenn and Christopher has said, and I've seen it happen in other, you know, on other topics and other areas. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you to our participants. Glenn, really tremendous work. Thank you for giving us concrete examples of the impact and the alliances that you are forming to really foster change, because that's what this is about. There are goals to meet. There is an urgency. I'll go back to this again. Climate critical time is here. So Glenn, we appreciate all of the work that you are doing in this space and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay,
And
Brianne, good luck.
Take care.
Good luck to everyone.
And I'll
Bye.
just say, yeah, also just check out Extreme Hangout in the green zone as well.
Yes,
Okay.
our
Yeah,
partners.
absolutely. And Amy, thanks for your leadership and thanks to the Purpose and Social Impact group within Fin Partners who have made this life's work.
It's important. And we are proud to work with all of our partners and beyond to promote this change that we're all collectively making, because one organization cannot do it all. So, you know, really honored to not to be cliche, but to spend every day making a difference here and talking about the great work, because the progress, it must be spread far and wide. So thank you all. Good
Thank
luck
you.
on the ground, and we have to do a follow-up.
Yep.
I see a follow-up webinar in a
Yeah.
couple of
Yeah.
weeks.
Take care.
Okay,
Good
thanks
luck on the
everybody.
ground.
Yes,
Take care.
exactly.